Welcome to the Commonwealth Club of California. I am Adria Breyer, the chair of today's program and the vice chair of the Health and Medicine Committee of the Commonwealth Club. Dr. Redeker, to paraphrase him, I'm so pleased it's taken us so long to get him here. Empowerment is a fear-based disease rather than wellness system. That's the programs. We want empowerment in a fear-based disease system. Our objective is wellness. Dr. Redeker has spent more than 15 years studying spontaneous healing, pioneering the use of scientific tools to investigate discoveries for supposedly incurable illnesses. His research has taken him from America's top hospitals to the healing centers of the world. And I want to personally acknowledge you, Dr. Jeff, because it takes a lot of courage to step outside of the traditional medical download. My mission for over 15 years with Commonwealth has been to bring cancer information that is lesser known, scientifically based, to empower the public. I know how important that is because I've had many cancer episodes myself and I had to carve my own path. So for you as a professional to go for the science and be courageous enough to step up and say, wait a minute, that's not what's necessarily always happening here. Thank you for doing that for all the people listening, for all your patients, and for everyone. Your podcast is going to be widely noticed. I've got a few questions for you before I turn it over to you. Would you please tell us what your professional background is?
Well, I guess the short way of telling it, I grew up on a farm in northern Indiana. I come from an Amish background, grew up in a very different culture than most of the world around me. I left all of that, went to college, and then I was a very confused kid, as a bit of a rebel, actually. I went to seminary then at Princeton and obtained a Master of Divinity and went deep into theology and philosophy of science. And then after that, I went to medical school. I fell in love with science, frankly, and then did residency in psychiatry. I am now on the faculty of Harvard Medical School and the medical director at McLean Hospital and chief of behavioral medicine at Good Samaritan Medical Center, which is a large urban medical center.
All right, that's fabulous. Give us some background on you. Where did you grow up? How did you get to where you got?
So I grew up on a farm in northern Indiana. Grew up with an Amish background, grew up in a culture very different than the world around me. And I was a confused kid, actually, had a lot of questions and a bit of a rebel. I left all of that and went to college. And then after college, went to seminary at Princeton and ended up getting a Master of Divinity, went deep into theology and philosophy of science and ended up falling in love with science. And so I went to medical school. And now I am the medical director at a branch of McLean Hospital in Boston and on the faculty of Harvard Medical School. And I'm the chief of behavioral medicine at Good Samaritan Medical Center, which is a large urban medical center in the Boston area.
Dr. Jeff, I have a whole series of questions for you. How did you become interested in this research?
So that's a long story. In 2002, an oncology nurse at Mass General, which is a large hospital in Boston, she came to me and said that she had just been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and told that she had a matter of months to live. So she wanted my help explaining this to her son. And then she went to a healing center and began calling me saying that she was seeing some amazing recoveries and would I be willing to look into it? I said no. I was a new young faculty member and medical director, and I didn't think anything likely real was going on, and so I declined. But Nikki was stubborn. She began having people call me from around the country and elsewhere saying they had medical evidence for the recoveries and did I want to hear the stories. I continued to say no for a while, but as these envelopes were mailed to me and medical records, as I opened these medical records, there's many stories that it was impossible to tell what was going on because they had chemotherapy or radiation, and I knew these illnesses well enough to know that there were competing explanations. But some of the stories and some of the medical evidence there was no good answer for him. And so the long and short of it is, in 2003, I did begin to collect medical evidence and try to figure out what was going on.
Was there anything specific that caused you to know that science and healing is more than it appears, especially with your science and theology balancing?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been a very personal journey where I've tried to reconcile two worlds within me that were difficult to rationalize or integrate. And so it's been a long journey of 17 years. And as I've done this, I've changed professionally and personally a lot. Um, it's changed the way I view everything, frankly.
You mentioned in our conversations that the patient's story is really important. I am so on board with that, especially having personally experienced.
Mm.
I'd like you to explain what you mean by that, though.
Well, the way I've come to understand this, see, the contrast that I have dealt with for years is I work in a psychiatric hospital during the day, I work in a medical hospital at night, and then I listen to these stories of remarkable recoveries. And the contrast between these stories and what we as physicians teach patients to do in the normal run of their illnesses is quite starkly different. And so over time, I've come to realize that in medicine, we are deeply trained in the disease model. And what we do is we actually exclude the story in order to penetrate through to the underlying signs and symptoms of any person who has that particular disease. And that's what we focus on. And there's a place for that that's important. It's just not the whole story. What I have come to realize is that by excluding the person's story, we're losing the keys to health and well-being that are really important. Until we understand what the illness means for this particular person and what's really going on in their lives, we're really limited in terms of what we can do. So I'm a big believer in getting the story. I start a lot of my interviews with patients in both the medical and the psychiatric hospital asking them, so what's been stressful lately? What do you think this is really all about for you? And so I try to not, I pay attention to what the illness is, but not exclude the story, the human story of what's going on. And it changes a lot of things when you do that.
My goodness gracious. You give people such hope. I'm so grateful. How do you envision medicine of the future?
Well, that's a great question. I think what's exciting is that we are at the end of an era. We are the end of an era of disease. This era started with early scientists taking and beginning to distinguish the signs and symptoms of an illness from the signs and symptoms of a different illness, and then creating a whole taxonomy or a classification system of diseases. And that's very helpful. Now we have that classification system by and large, but the set of questions that opened the era of disease is very different than the era that's now open before us, where we actually begin to study how people heal. Doctors like myself are trained to make a diagnosis and to start a medication, but we have not been trained and we don't study healing by and large. And those are not the questions we ask. We generally start a medication and help a person tread water with their illness by and large. And there's a lot of deeper holes we can go into in talking about that. But what's starting to happen in the last 10 or 20 years, we're in the very early stages of starting to actually ask questions about what is health, what is healing about, what is well-being. And we need to help this era really take hold and open. Another part about the future of medicine is about the democratization of medicine. All across the world, these institutions are slowly transforming as the forces of democratization begin to penetrate deeper. And that's finally starting to happen in medicine as well, which historically has been very resistant to that and has kept the doctor as the expert over your life and your body, even though they will only meet with you perhaps for 15 minutes at a time. What we know is that people know things about their lives and their bodies that are a critical piece of the healing equation, and the democratization that's occurring with the influx of technology, the apps on your smartphone. Eventually, what we're going to be able to see is that we will be more and more the CEOs of our own health, as Peter Diamandis says at Singularity University in Palo Alto in your part of the world. And we will more and more have technology helping us create data that is more powerful than the scientific studies that is based upon college students, perhaps, or a population that may be very different demographically from your own. As we begin to have real data rather than these small studies that may or may not be representative of your life at all, we will have much more accurate science, and people will more and more be able to take charge of their own health in a way that is really exciting. And health will increasingly be rooted in what's right and good about you rather than focus so much on the disease process, which to get really well, you have to really understand healing and well-being.
My goodness, how fortunate we are to have you here. Thank you for answering all those questions. There's going to be a lot more from our audience when you're done. I'm going to
Sure.
ask you if you will just take over the program right now and share all that amazing information and hope with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for your questions. So I've been doing this now. I've been collecting evidence since 2003, and I've had three strict criteria for this research. Number one, the person had to have a genuinely incurable illness, according to all that we currently understand. When people started mailing me their packets with their medical data and all of that, there was a lot of it's complicated stories, and some of these people had other explanations for how they could have gotten better. Some people hoped they were getting better. Some people thought they were better. And actually, when you look at the medical evidence, it wasn't that story at all. So it took me a while to begin sifting through all of this. So the first criteria I told people was that I wouldn't look at their story unless they had a genuinely incurable illness. And they also needed to have, number two, medically indisputable evidence for accurate diagnosis and clear evidence for recovery. And then number three, I told people there needed to not be any other complicating factors, such as an experimental medication or anything else that could potentially explain how they got better. So those three criteria have been what I have adhered to rigorously throughout this whole thing. It's helped clarify a lot of issues for me. So let's move on to the next slide. So what have I learned? That's a really big topic. I write about this at length in Cured. One of the things that I learned is that there's nothing spontaneous about spontaneous remission. We were taught in medical school that these events, these healings, are flukes with no medical or scientific value, and that they're rare. Well, it turns out that there's nothing spontaneous about spontaneous remission. It's not a fluke that these people got better. It's just that we never asked how they got better. And it turns out that there's common factors across many of these different stories. And these people found a path to healing on their own. And what science is great about is about taking things and then extrapolating things more widely. We know that birds fly by figuring out over time the Bernoulli principle. Now we have airplanes that can fly. And so we can then extend these principles and factors much more widely once we have studied them. So there's nothing spontaneous or without cause about spontaneous remission. You know, it's fascinating to me, of all the people I've studied, not a single person has ever had their doctor get curious about how they got better, which is fascinating. The really good doctors will say, well, whatever you're doing, keep it up because it's working. It's fascinating that our socialization process in medicine is so powerful that we aren't even curious about how people get better. What I've seen is that people have made major identifiable shifts in their lifestyle, in their perceptions of themselves. They've fundamentally changed how they understand themselves as a human being in the world. Common sense suggests that we should be studying these individuals. I believe these are the Tom Brady's from your neck of the woods at one point, Tom Brady's and the Serena Williams of health. And we study ultimate achievement in sports and ultimate achievement in business. We should also be studying in health. If I was ill, absolutely, I would want to know what the average person does. Our scientific studies are built around what the average person does. We reduce things around the mean and that sort of thing. But the people, the stories that we are going to talk a little bit about today, these are the ultimate achievers who are screened out in the data because they don't group around the mean. And they are doing things very differently than the average person does. So I feel privileged that this uncharted wilderness is something I can help map. It takes some different ways of thinking, but it's really important. Okay, let's move to the next slide. This is the outline of what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about why studying health and well-being in new ways is so important. We'll look first at the current state of Western medicine, particularly in regards to the major killers. We'll look briefly at the disease model and the future of less deficit-based models, models that are built more on what's right and good about each individual. And we will talk, as we already have started, about a new era where we actually study healing and well-being, where we place health at the center of our study. Then we will talk about the 4 pillars of healing and well-being that I have uncovered and been studying for years with these individuals. So let's see here. The next study is, let's move to the next slide. So I characterize Western medicine as really being, in many ways, a long line of ambulances at the bottom of a tall cliff. Western medicine is brilliant. When a person falls off that cliff, Western medicine is brilliant at whisking people off to the hospitals and the clinics and putting people back together in a way that is truly salvatory. My question and the challenge is, why don't we put guardrails at the top so that people don't fall off the cliff in the first place? The amazing individuals that I study did fall off the cliff, and they found ladders that helped them climb back up. It turns out that the factors they used to create those ladders, they use these factors much more intensely perhaps than many of us do, but those factors allowed them to climb to the top of the cliff. Those same factors help people not fall off the cliff in the first place as well. So these factors are very important, but they are very much neglected in the way we practice daily medicine. Let's move to the next slide. So let's look briefly at the state of modern medicine. As we said, modern medicine is wonderful and life-saving for acute injuries and illnesses, but it's limited and even destructive for the treatment of chronic or lifestyle illnesses. Nearly 1 in 2 Americans, that's 45%, have a chronic condition such as heart disease, cancer, diabetes, arthritis, and asthma. Rates for this are similar in many industrialized countries, and unfortunately, they're increasing rapidly, in part because obesity, but these are lifestyle illnesses that are going up sharply in many of the Western countries, and it's a tragedy that's doing so. Conditions such as these have created an international healthcare crisis and are crippling our health and healthcare systems, as we often hear. More than 2/3 of all deaths are caused by 1 of 5 chronic diseases, and those 5 are heart disease, cancer, stroke, lung disease, and diabetes. So these are very prevalent in the culture. They're the top global causes of death and disability, and they account for 75% of healthcare spending. These rates are increasing. There's an increased prevalence that has caused 2/3 of the increase in healthcare spending. And one other factor that we should discuss, the World Health Organization has named depression as the #1 health problem around the world. Depression also is associated with a high degree of disability and loss of productivity, loss of meaningful life, and increase in suffering. Depression also is going up around the world in sharply increased prevalence as well. So that's where we're at. It's a crisis. We have unsustainable healthcare bills. Many people suffer because of those bills, in addition to the suffering with their health conditions. It's a really big topic. We could go into the implications for what we're talking about today in terms of the COVID pandemic. Maybe we'll have a little bit of time with questions and answers to go into that. I should say there's many other illnesses that exist outside of these major killers. These also cause significant suffering and disability. 90% of the major killers are lifestyle illnesses. When I was in medical school, we were taught that these illnesses were largely genetic and inherited, but it turns out that's not the case. And although it has not been sufficiently changing the medical culture, we do now know that genes are not near as predetermining as we have been taught. Many genes are turned off and on by the lifestyle choices that we make. And the major killers are lifestyle illnesses. They're not nearly as genetically determined as we thought. So what is needed is a new way of thinking about healing and well-being. And there's a lot of new ways that are developing in our culture as all of these realizations are coming into more prominence. And today is one effort to do that. So we know when we think about it, the West is brilliant at focusing on the parts. We have microscopes that can go really into the subatomic regions. We have great technology. We have highly trained specialists who are very good at focusing on their area of expertise. If you have a medical problem, you go to the physician. If you have a psychological issue, you go see the psychotherapist. If you have a spiritual problem, you will go see the priest, rabbi, minister, or imam. But it's my contention that these highly specialized regions of knowledge are very important and very helpful. But if there's not a second step taken where the person and the expert step back and look at the whole picture and the ways in which all these dimensions interact, then the real power and opportunities for healing and well-being are missed. All of us as human beings live with an integration, a lived integration of these dimensions in our lives every day, but there's ways to take this more consciously to a whole new level. And that's what I'm interested in, is a way of thinking and a science that helps us not just specialize on the parts, but see the whole picture and take that to a new level. I can tell you stories about the ways in which we ignore the relationship of these dimensions. And there's a long history in medicine about how we got to this, where we have such difficulty seeing the way these dimensions interact. I had a patient come into the emergency room not that long ago, a 64-year-old woman. She had chest pain, and so she was worked up for a cardiac cause. Cardiac cause 2 days later came back negative, and she still had the chest pain. They asked me to see her, and I did what I often do. I started asking, I just simply began by asking, so have you had any stress recently? And she broke down in tears immediately. She said that the day before she came to the hospital, her husband of decades had announced to her that he was leaving the marriage and moving to Florida, and he left that day. She was a 64-year-old woman. She had been with him since age 14. She had never dated anyone else. She had never been with another man. She had never even slept in a house alone in her life. And she spent that night alone after he left, terrified, in shock, didn't even know how to begin coming to terms with what was going on for her, and came in the next day with chest pain. Well, I told her, you know, we're really worried about her. We want to help her deal with what she's facing. We want to give her some support. And she said, Doc, I'm a Roman Catholic. I don't believe in these things. And so she went home, and a month later she was back in the emergency room again with chest pain, but this time she had atrial fibrillation, which is a life-threatening arrhythmia. She will now need to be on very dangerous medications for the rest of her life. They have their own set of side effects and risks. And I can't prove that. Can I prove that her loss of her marriage and husband is the cause of her atrial fibrillation? No, I can't. But what I can tell you is that every day I see the effect of stress and one's experience of themselves and the world, the role that plays in our physical bodies. And I just believe that we cannot keep ignoring this. 85% of what walks into an emergency room or into a doctor's office is heavily influenced by stress. And I can tell you story after story. A woman who's admitted with thrombotic crisis every time she has a fight with her mother. There's just so many stories, and what's going on in our lives is very relevant. And my concern is that we eliminate these stories and don't even ask what's going on or know how to help people deal with them. So what's actually a really great step, however, though, is that now we're starting to realize researchers and doctors are getting better at stepping back and looking at the whole picture. And now we know that the problem is not fundamentally in a body part. We now know that a person does not have heart disease or cancer or diabetes or an autoimmune illness. More fundamentally, what they really have is chronic inflammation in their body, and then the most vulnerable body part is what breaks down first. And so they say it takes 30 years for what is proven in the lab to make it to the hospital or the clinic, and that's true. And I think we have a medical system that is not really helping people heal the inflammation in their body sufficiently yet, and I think that's something that is coming down the pike, but we can start doing that now and focusing more globally rather than just simply on the body part that is more of a symptom of a deeper issue. So let me tell you a few stories and to show you, I think pictures are powerful. I think stories are powerful. And this shows a little bit of the possibility. We don't have time to go deeply into these stories, unfortunately, but this gives you an idea. So June is an amazing woman. I became interested in her story initially because when you see 2 or 3 instances of spontaneous remission in one family, it's a little bit like poking the bear and saying, you know what, how can spontaneous remission be a fluke if very different illnesses in one family have found a path to healing and recovery when such was not thought possible? June was the leader in this for her family. She and her husband have a very loving, wonderful relationship. They have 3 incredible children. June was in her 20s. Her husband had finished law school. They were very much in love, and she was the head of accounting for a major accounting firm in San Francisco at the time. But she started to have this inexplicable pain, and she went to doctor after doctor, and it took her 2 years, I believe, to get the proper diagnosis. Turns out that she had ankylosing spondylitis, which is an autoimmune disease. It is incurable. We don't have good answers for it at all. And she was devastated, of course. She looked at the doctor and she said, well, I accept the diagnosis. I do not accept the prognosis. And June went on a long journey to begin to figure out what was going to help heal this. She wanted to have a normal life with her husband. She wanted to have children. And so June had been raised in a typical New York family, very traditional in its views, and a very loving family. Had very traditional views of medicine and all that. And this is well over 30 years ago, probably 40 years ago by now. But she decided to try yoga, and yoga was the entryway into a different life for her. This story is not just about yoga; it's about many things. But ankylosing spondylitis, I should say, as a way of showing you what this is about. Ankylosing spondylitis is a disease where your bones freeze into place and you become an immovable concrete mass. Beginning in the pelvis, your bones calcify and the calcifications creep up the spine, and you become more and more unable to move at all. And of course, in the later stages, what's tragic is that your ribs are no longer able to expand and contract, and so therefore they cannot expand and contract your lungs, and so breathing becomes a real problem. Uh, so, uh, so the calcifications freeze you into place. Well, she went into yoga, and then as she started to notice other things, she started to notice that she felt better if she ate foods that had dense nutrients in them. She began to feel better if she eliminated the processed foods and the sugars and the refined flours from her diet. And so the yoga became a doorway into a lot of things. Yoga became a way into managing stress, and she began to realize she needed to get out of chronic fight, flight, or freeze into a more parasympathetic and healing state. And she went through a lot of changes in her life in that regard. She quit her accounting job. She joined the business that she and her husband had started in LA, and she ended up then eventually, after having 3 beautiful children, decided to leave that job as well and really devote her time full time to both her children and to her health. And she was starting to make real progress with her recovery at that point. So now she has been disease-free for more than 30 years, completely disease-free. And you can tell that she's not at all a concrete, immovable mass. She is an amazingly vital, vibrant, happy lady who has no residue of illness in her. At one level, I'm sure that the yoga, it was very painful in the early years. I'm sure she was snapping the calcifications that were forming in her vertebrae and bones, etc. But it's about so much more than that. And I wish we can go into it more deeply about the deep changes in her spirit and in her energy that she pursued over time as she became liberated as a person and as a woman. And it's a truly beautiful story. Let's move on. I want to tell a story briefly of Emily Bowler. I do not tell the story of Emily in my book because I really stick in the book to the incurable illnesses. But this is an important story, not only because the pictures are great, and I think pictures are good, but also because I think it's important to show that these factors that we are going to talk about apply widely to many of us in our normal lives. These factors of healing and well-being are relevant for many of the issues, the illnesses that plague us. In 2008, Emily was an artist by training, and in 2008 she decided that she wanted to not just be an artist on paper, she wanted to be an artist with her life and with her body. What prompted this was an experience in Italy. As an artist, she was very interested in the antiquities and the art there, and she was at the sculpture done by Michelangelo, the statue of David. And she was looking at that, and somehow someone had defaced the statue a little bit with some mud or something, she said, and she was very offended by that and angry that such a beautiful piece of art could be defaced in that way. But then it hit her like a ton of bricks that she had been defacing her own mind and body for as long as she had been alive. And it was a huge experience for her to realize that this is what she had been doing. So she decided in that moment that she was going to stop defacing her mind and body and was going to take the dignity of who she was as a human being seriously. And she read a book that changed her life called Eat to Live by Joel Fuhrman. It completely changed her understanding of nutrition. She had been years of fad diets behind her, cycles of dieting and all that. But she had never understood nutrition. And I'm sorry to say that most of us don't. And as a physician, I can tell you that most of us in the healthcare field don't, unfortunately, understand nutrition. It's a combination of industry and government who's been influenced by industry, and also the academics. We have been paid to do research by the industry, and we end up with a way of understanding nutrition that is actually not true at all. And so she read this book, Eat to Live. It's like turning on the light. She began to realize that she needed to fill her body with nutrient-dense foods, and she didn't need to starve herself. She didn't need to restrict herself from how much she ate. She needed to give herself foods that were nutrient-dense. And she found that your body wants to heal and achieve a healthy weight once that occurs. Now, the two pictures on the left, this is Emily in 2008. She had heart disease. She was on medicines for heart disease, blood sugar, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, anxiety, and depression. She had a long list of medications she was taking. So with this new discovery that she had made, she decided she was going to track her progress. The picture in the middle is Emily in July of 2008. She was still on a lot of medications then, and really worried about what her future health was going to look at, given all the problems she was having with her blood sugar and blood pressure and everything else. The picture on the right is Emily in July of 2009. That's 12 months later. And again, this book was really important to her, Eat to Live. At that point, she is not only happy, she has learned that this is not about restriction. It's not about a lot of things. But at that point, her blood sugar was normal, her blood pressure was normal, her cholesterol was normal. She no longer needed medicines for anxiety and depression. She had a whole different life. Now, let me just back up for a moment to say that Emily had been through a lot. She had been through a lot of trauma and abuse as a child. By the time of 2008, she had been through the suicide of her son. She knew trauma from the inside, and she knew grief, she knew suffering, and her journey has been, I felt it's been a privilege for me to participate in it and see this happen. In the last 11 years, since 2009, she has continued to go down this journey into a new life. She wrote a book that came out a year or two ago called Starved to Obesity, and talks about how she was always starving herself and always unhealthy and ill, and what she has continued to learn. And now she is doing more and more speaking around the country and elsewhere on what health and vitality require. And so that's another story with good pictures, but I think it shows the relevance for many of us. Maybe you weren't diagnosed with cancer or an autoimmune illness, but these factors are still very relevant and very important. I want to tell the story briefly of Dana. Dana was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when she was in her early teenage years. She had an unusually brittle form of diabetes. And I tell her story not because she had this amazing recovery, but because she's part of this growing do-it-yourself movement that is so important and is developing steam in our country. I spoke at a conference of do-it-yourselfers at the University of Texas, Austin, a few years ago, and she was associated with the program. And she just has an amazing story. Very brittle diabetes, so severe that she could not sleep safely at night. She was at risk of dying because her blood sugars could go so quickly, too high or too low. And what she did was, she is doing what a lot of these do-it-yourselfers are doing. They're deciding to not wait for an expert to come up with a solution. She developed a artificial pancreas, and she made the software for it open source so that people around the world can take that same software and adapt it to their needs. And it's very emotional to see people doing such amazing things where this is truly the democratization of medicine, where people are finding ways and pathways to take charge of their health and well-being. I saw so many amazing stories at that conference. I could tell you many more stories, but I think that she's a good example of this whole do-it-yourself movement where people are taking charge. So we need to move on. There's many stories we could talk about today. Dr. Kane is a physician. She had idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. She went on disability, prepared to die, and now she's back at work, and she's so grateful for the lessons the illness taught her that she now makes home visits to patients who are so ill they can't leave the home, and she views this her way of expressing gratitude for the lessons she learned of the illness. It so fundamentally changed her experience of herself in the world that she views the illness as having been a profound gift. Claire Hazer, she's the person I start and end the book with. She was diagnosed by biopsy with the worst form of pancreatic cancer, which is called pancreatic adenocarcinoma, which is usually a death sentence. She was diagnosed in 2008 by biopsy. In 2013, she had a CT scan of the abdomen for unrelated reasons, and the cancer was gone. If you want to just look at her journey in more depth, www.livingwithpancreaticcancer.com. It shows the ins and outs of a human story so beautifully, and I think it's important for people to have the opportunity to go into these kinds of stories in more depth. There's so many stories. I've gone deep into the lives of well over 100 individuals over the last 17 years. There's so many stories that have been sent to me that I've not had time to go into. These stories are much more common. They're more out there than people realize in terms of prominence. It's just that they don't have a voice. It's not something that we know how to talk about with people. So there's many stories. The last one there, Mary Munsell, I do not tell that story in the book because it's about bipolar disorder, which you can't do a lab test for to prove that it's there or not. But I want to also make it clear I've seen recoveries from psychiatric illnesses as well. Could tell you many stories of that. Mary Munsell is just a good example of that. Chronically suicidal, was very deeply impaired to the degree that the Department of Mental Health in Massachusetts was at times visiting her apartment twice a day because of their concern about her suicidality. She said she found hope in our program at McLean. She left and went back to the art that she had not touched in years. The art, she said, healed her, and then she started a peer-to-peer counseling program to help people recover from the mental illnesses. And she now puts on an annual event, fills a ballroom in Cape Cod at a hotel every year, and I often give the keynote address and to get to see just the outcome of what she has been doing for years. She sends me articles of when she speaks before the state senate, in the newspaper articles that are done about her work, and it's truly an amazing story. So there's a lot of possibilities that we all have within us. We need pathways that help us activate these kinds of possibilities. I talk in Cured about the 4 pillars of healing and well-being. And number 1 is nutrition. We've touched just superficially on that. The second pillar is about healing your immune system. We touched a little bit on that, about how a person does not have a cancer problem, a diabetes problem, a heart problem, or a blood pressure or an autoimmune problem as much as a chronic inflammation problem. And if you want to heal the inflammation in your body, then you need to change the way you live, both in terms of nutrition and the way you manage stress. The third pillar is healing your stress response. I want to make it clear, not all stress is bad. We all need challenge stress to help us grow and learn. Running a marathon can be challenge stress if it helps you expand your understanding of what you're capable of. But that's very different than if you're in a toxic relationship, or if you come home from work every day depleted and questioning your value and worth, then that's toxic stress. And you're not going to be able to heal if you're in toxic stress because you're going to be in chronic fight, flight, or freeze, which is a very different kind of neurochemistry than what is required for healing. The fourth pillar of healing and well-being is about healing your identity and your beliefs. Now, what does that mean? This is a big one. What does it mean to heal your identity and your beliefs? It means that you need to learn how to focus on what is right and good about you, that you need to learn how to treat yourself with compassion and understanding rather than judgment and condemnation. That means you need to know what it takes to eliminate false beliefs. I think we all grow up and with the influence of our parents and kids on the playground and bosses and people who are friends, we all inherit or take in a set of complex beliefs, some of which are true and some of which are false. And it's my belief that if you carry within you a set of beliefs, some of which are true and some of which are false, you will be giving your mind, your body, and your life mixed messages. And so you will end up with mixed results in your life. So I think there's a lot to do with what it takes to heal one's identity. Every person brings something good and important in the world, and we need to build our lives on that foundation rather than believing that we're not good enough or that that we're defective in some way. One of the most common things that people have said to me over the years is that it took an illness for them to wake up and realize that they needed to stop taking care of everyone else. They needed to stop responding to the perceived expectations of others and begin to do what it takes to wake up to their own dignity and well-being. That's a really big journey, and it's a life-saving journey. It might even seem selfish to people. What I do sometimes is I put a person on a selfish bitch project because it seems selfish initially to begin thinking this way, and I can assure you it's not selfish. As my friend Gabor Mate says, he says, if you don't know how to say no, your body will eventually say no for you. And so this is a really big deal. One of the things I've learned along the way is that if you can die to an old version of yourself in such a way that a new, truer expression of who you really are can be born, sometimes you don't need to die physically yet. So it's really important for people to understand if you can make the hard choices to set up this new kind of life for yourself, it will change your relationships with others and it will change your relationship with yourself. And when that occurs, it's sometimes astonishing what becomes possible. I can tell you story after story of people who have changed so significantly that, for example, Jan, whose story I tell in Cured, she talks about walking down the street in Idaho where she has lived for many years, and people don't recognize her anymore because she has changed and she has a different way of experiencing herself in the world. And that's what it took for her to heal her body.
That was extraordinary. That your presentation was so empowering.
Mm.
And I guess your next book might possibly be talking about all these other experiences and including chapters on all these amazing people who are sharing, like the pancreatic women sharing the software.
Mm.
But,
Yes.
that is so,
Yep.
maybe you can just work until 2 o'clock in the morning and write your book until 4 o'clock in the morning. Maybe that would work. Is there a link to your McLean program, which sounds extraordinary? If people want to look at that?
Yes. McLean.harvard.edu is the McLean Hospital.
Okay, that's
McLean.harvard.edu. McLean, McLean Hospital.
gorgeous. You covered such a broad brushstroke. I even didn't anticipate you to cover so many that give so much hope. And you mentioned seriously, you mentioned depression, and we know depression is debilitating. We know from also an energy frequency point of view what that does, including the loneliness. Well, when you can offset that with the hope, that's extraordinary. That's our body being its own healer.
Well, doctors are taught to not be the purveyors of false hope, which I think is really important because that is important. But it's also important, it's also ethically important that we know how to provide grounded ethical hope that's grounded in real medical evidence. And so I just want us to understand that we all need hope. We all need to know that there are pathways and there are people who have been the forerunners, who have gone ahead and showed the way for a different kind of medicine and provided possibilities that maybe we hadn't thought of before.
I believe if you check your intuition, I've had 6, probably 7 episodes of cancer, and my oncologist actually fired me with the first one because my intuition was telling me this is the path to go on. Follow your hope, follow your intuition. I found doctors who supported me in my path, and you are one of those doctors. To
Well,
empower the individual to follow what they really know is best for them, I think is
yes.
extraordinary.
Yes, you have to put what you know about yourself at a deep level into the equation. You have a great intuition, and many people do, and just need to have that liberated so they can use that as a resource.
You said so many things. I wish we had another hour. One of the pieces that really reminded me, my dad had had PTSD. And I'm mentioning this not because of myself, but because it applies to a universe, actually.
Right.
I didn't realize as a kid that we pick up the energy of the people around us. Then
Yes,
we view the world with our reactions, including ourselves,
that's right.
with the energy that's not ours.
Yep.
So, do you have a way for people to, here you go, is there a simple key to release the energy that's not ours to be able to get back in touch more with self?
Well, that's a great question. I think that one of the concerns I have about some approaches to psychotherapy is that you go back and talk about things forever and go back, because I think too much of psychology is still rooted in a deficit based model as well. And so, what a person doesn't need to do is to go back and live in the dark cave of the past. They need help experiencing the dignity and the value of who they really are and realizing that that trauma had nothing to do with who they really are. Hurt people hurt people. So a person who doesn't know their value is going to treat another person like they don't have value. And the whole point is to leave that dark cave of the past and experience the dignity and value of who you are, and to know and come to experience the goodness of who you are so you can build a life on that and let go of the past. And it's important to deal with the past as a way of letting go of it, but not to go back and live in that cave and stay there and keep going over and over it and never leave that cave. So I'm a big believer in helping people experience their value.
I am so on board with you, including in my consulting. You said
Mhm.
something else about taking care of yourself and being selfish.
Right.
And I like to flip that a little bit and say, how would you talk to your best friend? Would you
That's
talk
great.
to your best friend the way you talk to yourself? And if we actually are conscious of that and flip it, it makes a whole difference. Our whole
It
energy
so does. That's a
changes.
great way to do it. Absolutely. It flips the whole perception of that.
Well, I have to have you back here. We have to talk further. We definitely have to talk further. We have a couple more questions. If we can squeeze them in, that would be gorgeous. Um, have you looked into what's the genetic markers for disease and the ability of people to heal from that if they have a genetic predisposition? You already said that 90% is lifestyle, which if I
Yes.
can clarify, if people look up epigenetics, if you agree with that, if
Right.
people look up
Absolutely.
epigenetics, it will expound on what Dr. Jeff has just said.
Yes.
You want to
That
address that as well?
Yeah, epigenetics is this whole developing science that shows that genes are not as predetermining as we thought in many situations. Now, there's a whole continuum. Some diseases are really defined by the genetic code, and anyone who has that gene is going to have a certain illness. But most of the diseases are much more pliable, and epigenetics just is the science of how genes are turned on and off. And that's largely by um, nutrition, by how we manage stress, by whether we are bathing ourselves in stress hormones or bathing ourselves in the pleasure molecules of dopamine, the serotonin, which is the happy molecule, these different molecules that are much more linked with a positive, true understanding of our value and allow us to live in a parasympathetic mode instead of fight or flight.
You talk about serotonin. I remember many years ago, I'd gone to Weight Watchers and I just was not able to follow a program. But every time I went, I would want an apple. And then I read a book that said apples help to create serotonin in the brain and
Yeah.
how the strength of the gut works with the neurotransmitters that
Yes.
feel good hormones, which goes back to what you were saying about nutrition.
Yes, right.
Right?
90% of our serotonin, which is the antidepressant molecule, is created in our gut. And so the nutrition we put in our bodies, that's what creates the serotonin. The medications that we take they don't create serotonin. They just help the serotonin that is there stick around a little bit longer. So if you want to create serotonin, then you've got to heal the gut, like you're talking, and because that's the gut's where it's created.
I think we've covered most. Oh, incurable cancers. Well, is there such a thing as incurable cancer?
It's a great question. I think we need to continue to have a lot more research in this area. I study in what I've studied are the most incurable illnesses, and the stories I tell in Cure are the most incurable cancers. And so, no, I do not believe that all cancers, I don't believe that there are incurable cancers, but I also want to be sensitive to the fact that this is a new wilderness. It's just now being mapped. And we need to continue researching how to help people find pathways, because there are so many toxic elements in our ways of thinking and in our nutrition that do create real problems for people. And the whole point of this book is to help people find pathways that feel liberating, not another way to feel judged or condemned or feel like they're not good enough. And so that's a really great question, but it's also a really deep answer that it needs to have ultimately, because the point is to liberate people, not to impose yet another burden on people.
Exactly. And while you're referencing your book, I want people to know they can go back to the website and order the book online at commonwealthclub.org. Um, I, again, there's so much that you said. I personally believe, and you've addressed it, that the body knows how to heal if we remove the impediments.
That's right.
And
Yep.
your pillars
Yep.
are right there.
Yep. It's beautifully said. It's all about removing the impediments so the body can heal. The body and the mind want to heal, and we just need to do a lot better job of focusing on things this way so that can occur.
To be continued. I am going to close the program now. I am so grateful to you. I know our listeners are so grateful to you. The Commonwealth Club is grateful to be able to have people like you. Their commitment is enormous, without judgment, bringing in all sides of the story, especially knowing that there's a lot of download in our disease system instead of the wellness system. And you're on the wellness system, yet knowing the disease side.
Yes.
That's an extraordinary gift.
Yeah.
So please, everyone, go to commonwealthclub.org. Please become a member. We need your support. Our programs are often free, or whatever donations you can possibly make. It's an extraordinary organization, and at some point we'll hopefully be able to see everybody in person. If you do become a member, you get to join our member-led forums, which are extraordinary. And right now I'm going to close the program. Dr. Jeff, I can't wait to talk with you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a real privilege being here.
All right. Be well, everybody. Remember to envision what you want.